Palestine, the home of two of the world's great religions, the ancient crossroads of civilization, the land bridge spanning 3 continents, has a historical, political, and spiritual resonance that reverberates far beyond its narrow borders. There are few places on earth where geography is so central to understanding the current conflict. To grasp the complexities of the struggle between Palestinians and Jews in the region, we need to know the maps. Yet, there is a lack of knowledge and information about the shape and contour of the contested area. The mainstream media simply do not provide maps, and when they do, they leave out critical information. The media often say the clash between Palestinians and Jews is as old as the hills. This is a fabrication. The actual conflict is about a century old and really develops with clarity after World War I. For more than 1,000 years, Jews traditionally have lived in relative harmony with their Arab neighbors. It was in Europe where, after centuries of pogroms and persecution, the greatest collective outburst of violence in history, the Holocaust, took place. Let's take a look at the maps and the geographical basis of the conflict. Palestine, Israel, and Imperial Geography. I'm David Barsamian. Welcome to this special Free Speech TV report. Palestine is located in what is called the Middle East. The Middle East itself is an imperial construction. Prior to American hegemony in the region, the British called it the Near East or the Orient. It was always in relation to the superpower, the great imperial hegemon, that the geographical area was defined. Palestine becomes a province of the Imperial Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, in 1516. And it develops internally within the Ottoman Turkish framework. In the early 1880s, the first European Jews began to settle in Palestine. About a decade later, in 1894, a French Jewish captain, Alfred Dreyfus, was accused of selling secrets to the Germans. The Dreyfus affair erupted into an enormous vitriolic attack on Jews in France. This deeply disturbed Theodor Herzl, who was a Viennese journalist covering the trial. A year later, he wrote a book called The Jewish State. In 1897, the first Zionist Congress met in Basel, Switzerland. And this was the first time that the idea of a Jewish homeland was articulated. Herzl and other Zionist leaders designated different parts of the world as possible homelands for the Jewish people. Among the areas considered were Argentina, East Africa, and Palestine. In 1914, World War I breaks out. The Turks align themselves with the Germans against the British and the French. The Turks experience a series of defeats in the Middle East and elsewhere. The British seize Palestine. In their imperial designs on the region, and in particular Palestine, the British were making promises all over the place. For one, they entered an agreement with the French called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which they divided the Middle East. The French would get Lebanon and Syria, and the British essentially would get everything else. The Arabs were promised independence for their support in an uprising against the Turks. You may recall Lawrence of Arabia being a major figure in this particular episode. However, after World War I, the Arabs bitterly learned the truth of what was going on behind their backs. On November 2nd, 1917, the British Foreign Minister, Lord Arthur Balfour, wrote a letter to a British banker, Lord Rothschild, in which he said, His Majesty's government looks with favor upon the creation of a homeland in Palestine for the Jews. Often the Balfour Declaration is interpreted as some kind of official act of the British Parliament. It was nothing of the sort. It should be emphasized that it was a private letter to a private British citizen. Nevertheless, the Balfour Declaration historically has been seen by Zionists as the juridical basis for the State of Israel. In fact, in the May 14, 1948 Declaration of Independence, the Israelis specifically refer to the Balfour Declaration as a kind of Magna Carta, as an enabling document which gave it legitimacy in its claim on Palestine. At the end of World War I, the British looked with favor upon immigration from Europe by European Jews to Palestine. The Suez Canal was the key waterway linking the crown jewel of the empire, India, to Britain. Jewish immigration into Palestine was seen as a critical element in the protection of the Suez Canal. The Jews in Palestine were a bulwark against independent Arab nationalism, which was always seen as a threat. And here it's important to point out that from the very beginning of Zionist immigration to Palestine, the Palestinians resisted what was going on. Right after World War I, until the beginning of World War II, there was a tremendous expansion of Jewish immigration from Europe to Palestine. Within a period of 2 decades, the Jewish population of Palestine tripled. In 1936, an extremely important event happens in Palestine. The Palestinians revolt. For 3 years, they fight the British. In this period, thousands of Palestinians were killed, many were exiled, and the Palestinian resistance was basically crushed by overwhelming British might. In 1937, the British set up the Peel Commission. This was the first attempt to divide Palestine into Arab and Jewish areas. The Peel Commission plan allocated less than 30% of the overall area of Palestine to the Jews. This paralleled their population at that time. The Arabs got around 70–75% of the area of Palestine. Both the Arabs and the Jews rejected the Peel Commission plan. At the end of World War II, Britain and France are devastated. While they still preside over vast colonial empires, it's increasingly difficult and expensive for France and Britain to defend their overseas colonies. It is at this moment that the United States emerges as the superpower to replace Britain and France, particularly in the Middle East. The United States identified the oil reserves in the Middle East as one of the greatest prizes in the history of the world, and they meant to get it. And to get it, that meant easing out the British and the French from the region. During World War II, the British stopped all Jewish immigration to Palestine. After the war, with the devastation of the Holocaust on everyone's mind, hundreds of thousands of European Jews were sitting in refugee camps all over Europe. The United States, Britain, Canada, and other liberal democracies did not open their immigration quotas to these displaced European Jews. There was one place for them to go, and that was Palestine. The Jewish Agency, the political arm of the Zionist movement, made a proposal in August 1946. It literally turns the Peel Commission's plan on its head. In this plan, the Jewish Agency says that 2/3 of Palestine should go to the Jews and 1/3 to the Arabs. Jerusalem is regarded as a trusteeship under United Nations control. In May 1947, the British officially announced to the United Nations that it is ending its mandate over Palestine. The UN responds. On November 29, 1947, it issues its own partition plan for Palestine into two separate states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now you can note that this division of Palestine by the UN is in rather sharp contrast in terms of demographics. Under the UN plan, the Jews are given 55% of the land of Palestine, even though their population is only 35%. The Arab majority, with 55% of the population, is only offered 45% of the land. The Palestinians reject the UN proposal. Why? The Palestinians felt that the UN proposal inherently discriminated against their majoritarian rights in Palestine, and they refused to accept the UN proposal. Almost immediately after the UN proposal, which was promulgated on November 29, 1947, civil war breaks out between the Palestinians and the Jews. Much of the fighting takes place in the Palestinian allocated areas of Palestine. On May 14, 1948, the Jews of Palestine declare a sovereign independent state. It is about this time that Arab armies from surrounding countries enter the fray. They were no match for the some 65,000 well-trained Israeli Jews who fought them off. At the end of the fighting in 1949, when the UN arranged an armistice in Palestine, the Jews now controlled 78% of the land of Palestine. This was significantly beyond the UN partition plan of 1947. The Palestinians were left with the West Bank and Gaza. The West Bank was occupied by the Jordanians. Gaza was occupied by the Egyptians. The struggle for Palestine today is over this remaining 22% of the original land. This constitutes Israel's recognized international border, the so-called Green Line. A critical outcome of the 1948 and 1949 fighting was the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem. 700 to 800,000 Palestinians were either driven from their homes or fled the Israelis. They wound up in refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. In the 1948 and 1949 war, the Zionists, who were better trained and organized and better equipped than their Palestinian and Arab adversaries, sought to maximize their control over all the land of Palestine. And the Israeli effectively nullified all the previous maps dealing with the region. Palestine, the home of two of the world's great religions, the ancient crossroads of civilization, the land bridge spanning 3 continents, has a historical, political, and spiritual resonance that reverberates far beyond its narrow borders. There are few places on Earth where geography is so central to understanding the current conflict. To grasp the complexities of the struggle between Palestinians and Jews in the region, we need to know the maps. Yet, there is a lack of knowledge and information about the shape and contour of the contested area. The mainstream media simply do not provide maps, and when they do, they leave out critical information. The media often say the clash between Palestinians and Jews is as old as the hills. This is conflict. Palestine, Israel, and Imperial Geography. I'm David Barsamian. Welcome to this special Free Speech TV report. Palestine is located in what is called the Middle East. The Middle East itself is an imperial construction. Prior to American hegemony in the region, the British called it the Near East or the Orient. It was a fabrication. The actual conflict is about a century old and really develops with clarity after World War I. For more than 1,000 years, Jews traditionally have lived in relative harmony with their Arab neighbors. It was in Europe where, after centuries of pogroms and persecution, the greatest collective outburst of violence in history, the Holocaust, took place. Let's take a look at the maps and the geographical basis of the conflict.